Hi, I'm Professor Fred Long, and I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 6, and I'll provide an overview of this chapter. This chapter will focus upon prepositions and their function. Prepositions are a type of part of speech, and so in our learning of the Greek language, we're adding part of speech to part of speech. We'll look at how they can be conjoined to verb to form compound verbs. Then we'll consider their possible meanings by looking at agency, means, source, and the common divine passive. We'll also note how pros, a preposition, can mark the indirect object. We'll then look at special uses of the present tense, and there's a brief discussion of the historic present. And then we'll conclude by looking at major lexicons and comparing their entries for words. But first, let's go to the vocabulary. First, we see compound verbs. Apokrinome, I answer back. Apoluo, I release or send away, or I pardon. Aperkome, I go away or depart. Dierkome, I pass through. Now, what's going to happen with these next few verbs is you may recognize the stem erkome. To that stem, verb stem, is going to be added prepositions, and they're going to slightly affect the meaning. So you have es erkome, ex erkome, I go out. Pros erkome, I come to. And then we have prepositions presented. Apo, which has alternative forms, af and ap, depending on the next letter following them, meaning from. It's always found with the genitive case. Is, which occurs always with the accusative, and it can mean into or to or for in the sense of purpose. Ek or ex takes the genitive from or out of. En with the dative means in, among, or with. We have enopion with the genitive, which means before, in face of. Pros with the accusative, that means towards or to. Soon with the dative, which means with or along with. Now, these first set of prepositions will only occur with one case. And what that means is that the noun, these prepositions, are going to be followed by a noun. And that's called the object of the preposition. That object will always be in that same case. But there are prepositions that will take more than one case. They'll take two or even three cases, not in this chapter, but two prepositions in this chapter are presented that take two cases. Now, what this means is that the meaning of the preposition will vary depending on the case of the object. Dia means with the genitive through, but when it's found with the noun in the accusative, it means because of or on account of. Upo, which has alternative forms uf and up, with the genitive means by, in the sense of by means of. With the accusative, it means under. Well, look at the progress that you're making in terms of this vocabulary. Be sure to stay focused and work diligently to memorize the words. So prepositions form prepositional phrases. These phrases are modifying expressions in the sentence, and they have two functions. They can either function to modify a verb, which is adverbial in use, or they can modify a noun or substantive, which is called adjectival. They're very dynamic, and sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what it is that they're modifying. In the marking method, we put prepositions within parentheses. So when you're reading through a sentence and you come across a preposition, you put a parentheses in front of it and then you look for its end. That preposition is going to form a very discrete phrase, and it'll be a tight unit together. Now, there may be other elements inside of that phrase, like a genitive modifier that's possessing something, and there'll be articles that go with nouns, but the prepositional phrase is a discrete unit, and you put parentheses around it. As soon as you see it, you start it, and then you look for where that phrase ends. I've already talked about the object of the preposition, how that will vary. Now, in this lesson, I've only given you a few prepositions and some of the most easily accessible ones that occur only with one case, and then I've given you two that occur with two cases. So look at these very carefully. Now, there's a couple other prepositions which are called improper prepositions. These are improper in the sense that they're becoming more and more like conjunctions. Every now and then they can function somewhat independently as a conjunction. Commonly, there's different semantic relations conveyed by prepositions and adverbs. And so some of these you may be familiar with, others not. In a section down below, further in this chapter, we'll talk about some of these and some of their overlap. There's a lot of nuance conveyed in prepositions. Prepositions can be added to verbs and words to form compounded forms. Actually, it happens quite often. The preposition's influence is not always the same. Sometimes there's an unapparent effect on the stem of the word that's formed with the preposition. This has historically been thought to be the case with apokrinome. However, I think that the effect of the apo is actually separating. I answer back or I answer away from, in the sense that I'm moving the conversation in a different direction. So even though it's unapparent, there may have been some reason for it initially, but in the use of the language, that has been forgotten. Sometimes the effect of the preposition is to add semantic meaning to the verb. That occurs very commonly with apokrinome verbs, where the preposition added to the front clearly adds another dimension to the movement of the verb. One of my favorite uses of prepositions is what's called the perfective or intensive use. Here, the preposition intensifies the action of the verb or completes it, and it emphasizes the completeness of that. For example, there's a verb estheo, which means I eat. Well, kata is a preposition that means down. It can mean down. And so literally when you add kat with estheo, it means I eat down or I gobble down. Now in English we would say eat up, which means finishing everything off of our plates. In Greek it was more I eat down. Here's a list of prepositions added to the front of verbs that you can study. It's really quite fascinating. There's some really interesting examples of a special morphological marking. You can actually add three or two or more to really begin to nuance some meaning. Sometimes the preposition creates redundancy, and I think this redundancy is for effect. It certainly would have been heard in the pronunciation of the Greek. So the redundancy is in the prepositional phrase and in the verb. I have discussions there. All right. Well, let's look at some concepts of agency, means, source, and the divine passive. Agency has to do with a person doing something. Means has to do typically with a non-person doing something. Source has to do with the origin of what is happening. Sometimes that can be very similar to means or agency. And divine passive has to do with when you have a passive voice verb, like I'm being hit, and there's no specification of who's doing the hitting. In the context, it may be God is the one acting. Now in that example, obviously that might be a brother or sister. But if I were to say I am being saved, the question would be, well, who's doing the saving? If it's unspecified, but it can be implied from context that it's God, then we would call that a divine passive. So when we have a passive voice construction, we expect there to be some indication of the means or agency or source or origin of who is doing the acting. And so this discussion simply describes that in the different constructions that may be used. Hupo, for example, with the genitive, indicates personal agency. Impersonal means can be indicated by the dative case alone. This is a special use of the dative case. We mark this with curly braces. Also, we can use the preposition "n" with non-persons typically, unless it is kind of an indirect way, an instrument, if someone's being used as an instrument. Intermediate means or intermediate agency can be expressed through dia. Dia can work with both persons and instruments. And so it's a very versatile. It's intermediate because by using dia, there's some understanding that there's a primary agent or source, and then the dia marks the intermediate one. Source, the idea of source can sometimes approach that of agency and means. And we've also talked about the divine passive. I've given you an example up above. So in this checkpoint, you can look at some prepositions and special case uses in Romans 3. The prepositional phrase with pros may mark an indirect object. Indirect objects you've learned so far are typically marked with datives, dative case nouns, and that's true. But you will find on occasion pros. They mean basically the same thing. They're often translated the same way. But pros seems to mark nearness, and I think also intensity. So when pros is used, there's a marking of nearness and intensity, and that intensity sometimes might be intimacy, sometimes it might indicate animosity. So you need to look at these closely in context and take notice. Now the present tense has special uses that grammarians have identified. Remember that the present tense carries imperfective aspect. That is, that the action is viewed internally as ongoing or as incomplete. In other words, it's opened up and it's still unfolding. Grammarians have categorized different uses. That is, they've assigned or attributed labels to certain instances. And it takes a while for the beginning student to get used to this kind of labeling. You need to be careful with the labeling that it's not overused. But basically you have about 5 different broad categories. The first one is that there's some kind of repeated action that is being indicated by the present tense. The second is instantaneous. That is, that the action is happening right as it's being described. A special use that's fairly common in the Gospels is a historic present. That is, the present tense is used to describe past events. But the function here of the present is to open up the discourse, and it anticipates actually what's going to be happening next. So it's a way to set off as important what is just going to be happening and what follows. So it's a forward-pointing device. Sometimes the present has a futuristic sense to it, and then sometimes the present tense is used for attempted but then failed actions. Be careful of these labels, to not assign them too whimsically. Remember that the context must determine how these verbs are being used. And so we need to just differentiate between what is inherently conveyed by the present tense and what is constrained by the context in terms of the kind of action that the verb is describing. I've got a discrete section on the historic present and discourse pragmatics you may want to look at. Finally, let's look at some major lexicons. The standard lexicon that we use is called BDAG. There's also Lowe and Nida, and then there's Liddell Scott Jones. These lexicons are worth consulting when looking for a basic range of meanings. And I have a discussion here that compares some of the entries. So read that discussion, and hopefully that'll help you to think more about lexicons. Finally, the chapter concludes with a discussion of divine agency and human response based on Ephesians 2:8-10.